I come from a country where Marxism is considered not just a political heresy, but a religious heresy. And of the two kinds of heresies, perhaps the latter is more important. So when I come from Pakistan to the People's Republic of China, it's a huge culture shock for me, not just because, of course, I'm in an entirely different culture, but more importantly because being a Marxist, coming from a country where Marxism is a bit of a heresy, not a bit of a heresy, it is a heresy, to a country where the country itself is run on the basis of Marxist principles is a huge culture shock for me. It fills me with immense joy to think that the most populous country in the world will also be, or is already, the most advanced country in the world. And in my view, and I think also in the view of the leadership of China, this is entirely not due to foreign investment, not due to capital coming from abroad, but due to the entire change in the worldview and vision and the way of looking at society, looking at history, looking at nature, brought about by historical materialism. So every advance made in China, every family lifted out of poverty, every school that is built, every hospital that is constructed, all the infrastructural projects that make the lives of people in China better fills me both with a little bit of envy, I must admit, and also a lot of pride. Let me begin with pride. It fills me with pride not because, obviously, I'm not Chinese. This is the second time that I've visited the country. But it fills me with pride because, being a Marxist, I feel that these achievements are part of the achievements of the struggle for a new society, of which I myself very much feel a part. But it also fills me with a bit of envy, I have to be honest, maybe a little bit of jealousy even, only because I feel that all of this could have also been something that we ourselves in Pakistan could have achieved for our people. Naturally, when I come here and I look at the incredible development of China, I cannot help but feel that Pakistan ought to be developing in much the same way. So it is, of course, very interesting to note that there was a time when Marx wrote, he said in the Communist Manifesto, that the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most, and he uses very 19th century terms here, barbarian nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. How ironic then that today it is the cheap prices of Chinese goods that are battering down the European walls of the civilization mongers, to use another expression by Marx. And that really shows you the inversion in the dialectic of history. Those who were once advanced are now holding back the rest of the world. And those who were once colonized, on whom there was war declared, who went through perhaps a century of humiliation, are now rising up. And it is for this reason that I would like not just China to overthrow its century of humiliation, which it has, but for the rest of the third world to follow suit and to overthrow the centuries of humiliations that people in Asia, Africa have suffered. And I believe this is possible only through changing our view, our vision, changing our understanding of history, of society, by embracing dialectical materialism. It is the view of some people that the third world is held back because of its own culture. It is held back perhaps because the productive forces are not advanced enough. If the productive forces were to develop, then the culture would change, society would change, there would be a revolution, and so on. But I think it is the other way around. In fact, the productive forces are held back by the social system, by the thought processes, by the regressive kind of political structures. And if those political structures, those relations of production, the superstructure that accompanies them, all of that is transformed, is changed, then I think we will see that the productive forces in Africa and Asia will be unleashed as they have been unleashed here in the People's Republic of China. So my presentations today are a small effort in that particular direction for us to understand what the third world has been going through and perhaps what we need to do to change that. It's not a story of China. In fact, quite the reverse. China is the exception that proves the rule. It's the story of what China is not that I'm going to tell you today. It's the story of the rest of the third world. And my two lectures today are going to be, so first I'm going to talk about the development of underdevelopment, and I'll be looking at the work of Samir Amin in this process. And this will hopefully lay down the broad framework in which we try to understand international relations and the international political economy. And then I will show you some of the nitty-gritty of what's been happening in the last, in the period from the Second World War till today. And you'll see how this is, how it plays itself out, how it operationalizes itself. So that's the plan for today. There was a time in the history of Egypt when the intelligentsia in Egypt was almost entirely taken up either by the Marxist movement or by the religious right, the Ikhwanul Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. So Egypt, in fact, has produced some phenomenal, incredible scholars. And perhaps from the global south, the name that gets taken the most with respect to Egypt is Samir Amin. There's a lot of very interesting things he says. Some things are interesting without necessarily being things that we agree with. Other things are interesting as well as being extremely important for us to understand. There was a time, in fact, it might interest you to know, where Samir Amin was a huge proponent, before he passed away naturally, of the economic model of the People's Republic of China. And he, in fact, posited that as the model that should be adopted in the third world. And it's the work that I'll be focusing on today. So today, I'm mainly looking at this particular work. Although we have lots of other very important works from him, The Implosion of Contemporary Capitalism, Only People Make Their History, Obsolescent Capitalism, The Liberal Virus, and you have The Law of Value and Historical Materialism. One of his very important works is Eurocentrism. In fact, many people think that Samir Amin is a key writer in the development of the idea of Eurocentrism. Class and Nation, Historically and in the Current Crisis, Only People Make Their Own History, and Global History, A View from the South. These are some of his most famous and well-read works, although there are many others. His approach to understanding his history is what we would refer to as a global historical materialism. Why global? Because he wants to situate the development of the third world in the context of what is going on in global capitalism. And that's very, very important. He is one of the key figures to develop what we today call dependency theory, or also we refer to it as the theory of unequal development or unequal exchange. He was a huge proponent of the idea that the third world needs to delink from the capitalist West, from imperialism, from Europe and the United States of America, and follow what he called a socialist polycentric development, as opposed to a world in which where there's only one hegemon. As I said, he was a big name in the development of the overall concept of Eurocentrism. He critiqued Western development models, and of course, he criticizes capitalism and what comes out of capitalism, the peculiar form of globalization that comes out of capitalism, imperialism, and as I've mentioned already, unequal exchange. To be able to situate and understand Samir Amin, it's very important to understand what is broadly termed as modernization theory. Anybody recognize this person on the screen here? Do you know who that is? Okay, so this is Walt W. Rostow, who wrote a very important book called The Stages of Economic Growth. He also wrote another important book called The Anti-Communist Manifesto. And you can imagine that he was very much part of the US establishment and working against communism. Now, his approach is not unique, although it is hugely influential. Because if you look at most of what you read in international relations theory, and most of what you read in international political economy, and pretty much everything you read in The Economist and Newsweek develops out of this overall overarching framework. So if you want to understand Samir Amin, to understand my lecture today, you have to first understand the theory that they are arguing against. And you'll be surprised and perhaps shocked even to discover how widespread the assumptions of this theory are. Although modernization theory or theorists, although they don't call themselves that, they don't say, oh, I'm a modernization theorist. This is a category I am placing them in, and the literature places them in. Although they don't ever say this, but the sum total of what they're trying to say is the following: the West is not responsible for the underdevelopment of the third world. This is very central to their understanding of what is happening around the globe. So then if the West is not responsible, who is responsible? Third world countries themselves. They are responsible. There is something in those countries. It could be their culture, it could be their political culture, it could be their business culture, it could be their political institutions, it could be just certain other economic bottlenecks. Whatever it is, third world countries are backward according to this vision because of their, quote, pre-modern culture. And here I'm using the term culture very broadly. Because of their pre-modern economic formations, political formations, ideas, culture, literature, whatever. They are all pre-modern. The surprising thing is that they continue to write this even in the 21st century. So if Pakistan is backward, it's backward because Pakistan is pre-modern. If Egypt is backward, it's held back by its own culture. That could be Islam, it could be something else, it could be Egyptian culture, etc. And socialism, or any move towards the state controlling the economy, or these countries protecting themselves in any way, shape or form from predatory practices by the West, is considered by these scholars to be really, really bad for these countries. They say this will isolate these countries from the advanced West, and what these countries really need is trade with the West, they need investment from the West, they need interaction with the West. The greater this interaction, the faster their economy will grow and develop. So one key idea here is that they have already posited a sort of dichotomy. And because this dichotomy between the advanced West and backward Asia or Africa exists to some extent, of course, geographically, naturally, but on the other hand, it also exists politically. African countries are independent countries, Asian countries are independent countries, European countries are separate and independent countries. Because of the political independence of these units of analysis, the assumption, the key assumption, and you might want to write this down or type it out. This is the key and most important assumption, and it runs like a golden thread through most of international relations and most of international political economies. Very important to grasp this, is the idea that the economic boundaries and the political boundaries somehow are identical. Let me repeat that so you get that clearly. Whenever we examine let's say we're examining Pakistan today, we talk about the economy of Pakistan, we talk about the politics of Pakistan. So because Pakistan is an independent country, it has a seat at the United Nations, we think that the economy of Pakistan must also be an independent entity. We cannot imagine that economic boundaries and political boundaries are not the same. If I were to draw a map of the world based not on politics, but based on market access, based on access of capital, based on the movement of capital, based on trade, it would look very, very different from the political map of the world. For example, you would see that the US economy is not just inside the boundaries of the United States of America. The US economy extends into Mexico, it extends into Latin America, it extends over into Philippines and into East Asia. So what we call the US economy is not constrained by the boundaries of the political boundaries of the United States of America. It's the same with Britain, it's the same with France. The French economic boundaries would embrace all of Northwest Africa. That is the key thing that Samir Amin tries to explain to us. And that is the key thing missing from this kind of scholarship that I refer to as modernization theory. Look at any UNDP report, look at any IMF report, look at any World Bank report, look at any report that's written internationally. You're always situating economies by their political units, GDP of Pakistan. In fact, we know we live in the era of so-called globalization. We know that the GDP of Pakistan or the GDP of any specific country is yes, it's the domestic product made within the boundaries, but it's very different from GNP. It's very different from actually how those economies come together. So when we're undertaking an economic analysis, for the moment we have to forget about political boundaries. The reason we can't entirely do that is because it's the governments that are going to put together the economic data. So the data is disaggregated in accordance with how the world is politically made up. But that's not what the economic map of the world really looks like. Samir Amin points out that if you think about what the third world is going through, you have to go through these 6 particular very important principles. These are the features of the global political and economic order today. And I'll explain them one at a time. Let me just read them out to you first. You have the idea that the third world is not an independent economy, but it is really part of the global capitalist system, except in the international division of labor, it is capitalism of the periphery or in the periphery. And owing to that, it has a peculiar form of disarticulation of its economy, of its productive forces. We have monopolies, unequal exchange, as a consequence, the drain of surplus from the third world into the first world, the placing of a comprador elite in the third world, and the cultural hegemony of the first world. So let's begin with the first point, capitalism in the periphery. Samir Amin is at pains to point out that the third world is not simply in an earlier stage of development. This is what modernization theorists teach us again and again. And I'm repeating again and again because I want to drill this into your mind. It's not simply at an earlier stage of development. Capitalism in the periphery produces a distorted form of industrialization. When the French took a hold of Vietnam, they converted Vietnam into a place from where they could extract rubber. When the British came to China, they fought with the emperor. They fought 2 wars with the emperor to have the right to sell opium to the people of China. When the European capitalists came to India, they turned India from a creator of cotton from a producer of cotton into a net importer of the cotton products that were being created in their mills in Manchester and in the United Kingdom. When the Spanish, Portuguese, French, Germans and British came to Africa, they converted the entire continent into a reserve from where they could hunt for slaves, which they transported to the American continent in millions, 13 million people. I went to West Africa and I went to Goree Island, which is the island from where the French would take African slaves across the Atlantic. And I cannot tell you, it is absolutely horrific to see just how that arrangement was made. They had a pit over there. They had one room which was a room for healthy slaves. They had another room for slaves that were not healthy enough to make the voyage. So they would put them in that room and they would feed them so that they would get healthy. Then they would go for the voyage. And they had a third room which was this high, literally this high. And they would push people into that room if they were rebellious. And the people had to live in that room crouched like this for weeks before they were let out. And they would cramp people into that room, and they were eating there, and they were sleeping there, and they were defecating there. Absolutely horrific. You see that, and I tell you, it robs your faith in humanity. And you realize that the real history of capitalism is essentially slavery. And when they transported all these people to the American continent, what happened to the original people that lived on the American continent? They were wiped out. They were destroyed. So the roots of the modern world, the world that we see today, the capitalist world, which we so love to admire capitalism. The roots of capitalism are in slavery, are in opium wars and the sale of drugs, are in genocide of the native population of the American continent, are in the destruction and mass famines in India. These are the roots of the modern world. The modern world is a pretty horrific place, if I'm fair and honest to you. So when Europeans took over Asia, Africa, they transformed these societies. And this was not 10 years ago. We're talking 19th century. We're talking 18th century. It was going on from then. They completely transformed the economic structure of those societies. Therefore, to regard those societies as being, quote, untouched by capitalism is absolutely absurd. To think that Africa is, quote, untouched by capitalism is absurd, because it was capitalism which instituted slavery, the Atlantic slave trade in Africa. Let me tell you that when they would take the slaves across the Atlantic, more than 1 million slaves died along the path. More than 10%, 15% slaves died along the path because they would pack them like sardines. And of course, if you're packed in that particular way, you're defecating in that place, you're eating in that place, everybody's bound to get sick. So they would get sick, and when they would get sick or die, the slavers would take out the slaves and they would just throw the bodies or throw the sick people overboard. So they threw more than 1 million people into the Atlantic along the routes of the slave trade. They threw, and you know what would happen to those bodies or those people who thrown? The sharks would come and eat the meat. And this changed the entire ecology of the Atlantic Ocean along that particular route. Because suddenly the sharks had so much food that the shark population along the route became massive. It just gives you an idea of the scale of barbarity that was practiced, to create what we call the modern world. And what did they do to the economies where they took a hold? They converted them into export-oriented industries. These industries, the economy, the new structure was not meant to serve the people of that country. India was completely restructured in such a way as to basically supply cotton, raw cotton, to the mills in Manchester and in the north of England. That meant that the railway infrastructure, the road infrastructure, basically started from agricultural areas and went to the port. And from the port, of course, all those commodities were taken to the global north. So the entire structure of the economy was created in such a way as not really to satisfy the needs or the welfare of the people, but really to feed the capitalist machine of Europe. There was a reliance on low wages for labor, minimal domestic value addition, and so on. Everything important they could do, they wanted to do it in the West. All the manual work, the least skilled work, the hardest work, the back-breaking work was going to be done in the East and in the global South. This disarticulated production. What do I mean by disarticulated? It broke up that society in a way in which we are still recovering. Because industries now existed in isolation from each other. They were not connected with each other. They were not articulated with each other to serve the people of India. They were disarticulated internally and articulated to serve basically global capitalism. And this path of development led to the growth of dependency. These countries today, unlike China, are dependent on the West. They cannot survive without loans, they cannot survive without trade, they cannot survive without interaction with the West. So therefore, whenever you pick up any text of international relations, how many students here are studying IR, international relations? Okay, and global political economy, and political science, and what are the rest of you studying? Sir, we're not studying. We're only pretending. So tell me, what are the majority of you studying here?
Anthropology.
Sorry?
Anthropology.
Politics? Anthropology. Wonderful, wonderful. And how many people studying anthropology? Sociology?
Law.
Law. Okay, law. And so this is kind of really out there, I guess. Literature? Okay, all right, 2 people. What am I missing? Art? Architecture? Okay. Architecture? Really? Okay. Very good. Art, okay. Art and architecture. We'll go with both. So whenever we look at the economy, the international political economy, the international order, this is what we have to grasp, that the third world countries, the global south, and again, I'm not putting China in here, they are not independent units. They are building blocks of a capitalist world economy. The third world is therefore a peculiar part of capitalism. It's on the periphery of global world capitalism. That's what gives it its character. That is what gives it its unique path of development. Not that it is untouched by capitalism, but that capitalism has disarticulated production in these countries to make it part of a global division of labor in which these countries would be part of the periphery. And that's why its development is entirely subject to the imperatives of the capitalist imperialist center. So if the American economy is doing well, Pakistan is doing well. When America sneezes, achoo, we get a cold. We get a cold, right? In 2008, you saw when the United States experienced its own financial crisis, almost every country in the world went into crisis with the exception of China. And that's because you have a very different economy, precisely because although China is interacting with the West, is producing, is inviting investment, is also selling abroad, all of these things. But the manner in which China is integrated into the global capitalist economy is entirely different from the way in which India or Pakistan or most of Africa or Latin America is integrated into the global capitalist economy. So, if we look at the phases of capitalism, Samir Amin tells us, we can see that from 1500 to about 1800, the early 19th century, you had a phase of capitalism which he refers to as mercantilism. That simply means that the capitalists of that period were mainly interested in buying and selling. They were not so interested in coming to the third world and setting up factories and so on. They were mainly interested in selling the things that they were producing in the third world or buying things that existed in the colonial world. From 1800 to 1880, through the 19th century, we see rapid industrial expansion. We see a situation in which, for the first time, we see the setting up of industry, but now on a global scale. When I say it's industry, I don't mean modern industry. I went to Vietnam and I visited the museum there where they looked at where they had put together the kind of industries that the French had created. And the technology was so backward that I was shocked. I was like, can we really call this industry even? It's not really even industry. But at any rate, from 1880 till today, we have a third phase of capitalist development, which is referred to as the monopoly phase of capitalism. Because the concentration of wealth has grown so much that capitalist industries today have a virtual monopoly over huge markets across the world. And from 1971, we entered yet into another phase of monopoly capitalism, which is referred to as late monopoly capitalism. So this kind of late monopoly capitalism is an oligopoly of finance capitalism. Basically, the whole economy is run by bankers. I like to call them wankers, but sorry, I hope there are no bankers here. It's run by bankers because in finance capital, in a bank, the capital of all of society comes together. They can then direct where it will flow, where it goes. It's a kind of capitalist central planning. That's really what happens. But the central planning is not done by people who are elected to office. It's done basically by, bankers. It just comes naturally, you know. It's done by bankers who are private capitalists. They can determine whether there will be more investment in computers, or there will be more investment in railways, or there will be more investment in whatever. If you control the financial sector of any economy, you really control the entire economy. And since China has 4 banks, but the main 4 banks are all basically state banks, that's why the state is able to direct how the economy will grow. It's not the case with respect to Pakistan. It's not the same with respect to Pakistan because finance is not under the control of the government, but the government has to borrow from the banks. It has to say, I can't meet my targets, can you please give me some money? So the overall direction of the economy is managed by finance capital, not even by the elected representatives of the people. In this particular scenario, we see that stagnation is the rule. Rapid economic growth is the exception under late capitalism. What we look at as financial growth, the financialization of the economy, is not what Samir Amin is talking about. He's talking about the growth of industry, the growth in the ability, the productivity of labor, the ability of labor to produce. That's not growing. He's saying mainly that is stagnant. Sometimes it grows, but mainly there's a lot of stagnation because there's huge monopoly formation and there's huge money to be made from financial and intellectual rents. The rapid growth from 45 to 75, after World War II, there was rapid growth. He says is a unique product of post-war historical conditions, which was basically that because of the massive socialist bloc, because of the victory of the Soviet Union and also the formation of the People's Republic of China and the victory in the Korean War against the Americans, the Western capitalism also, they started a new model of development which ran till the 70s. That was Keynesian demand management. And under Keynesian demand management, they adopted many socialist principles. And that's why they grew, but this was the exception, not the rule. And in the 70s, Keynesianism was overthrown, neoliberalism took its place, and so things began to change once again. It changed really after OPEC. That's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They created a cartel. And after that, we see the financialization of the economy, rapid financialization of the economy, deepened globalization. This was a strategic response to what happened with OPEC, and institutional changes that led later to the financial crisis of 2008. We'll study all of that. So in this period of late financial capitalism, late monopoly capitalism, you have a triad of people who are in power: the United States of America, Europe, and Japan. And they come together, not Japan, but European countries come together in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and financially in the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. It's through control of this Bretton Woods system and enormous military superiority that they are able to essentially control the globe, the world. So this is what we see as the overall picture that emerges at the global level. You have the core countries, which include European countries, it includes the G7, includes Japan, etc. And they are exporting high-cost consumer goods into the semi-periphery and into the periphery, and importing cheap labor, raw materials from the periphery as well as from the semi-periphery. This is the global division of labor. This is how the world today works. In this scenario, naturally, the European countries, the West, continues to exercise a monopoly. They want to maintain their monopoly over key things. Technology is the first and most important. Global finance, monetary systems, financial systems, key natural resources, for example, minerals and so on. Mass communication, specifically the media. If you look at the globe, if you look at the political economy of the media, there are 6 corporations that basically own 90% of the global media, and military dominance through weapons of mass destruction. These are the 5 key monopolies that imperialism needs to hold on to in order to control the world. So multinational companies dominate technology, they dominate finance, trade, etc., and they maintain their critical control over key technologies, key innovations. Of course, the big battle right now is over artificial intelligence. This creates a form of technological dependence of the third world on the first world. Developing nations have to import computers, machinery, cameras, whatever from the first world, and the first world is able to extract intellectual rents on the basis of intellectual property rights and so on, and it manages to keep key findings and scientific research to itself, and in that way dominate. The big struggle at the moment, of course, I think you all know here in China, is over artificial intelligence. The control over semiconductor and computing power supply chains is right now what is reshaping the entire world. That's why you see sanctions as well as export controls. For example, the US has restricted AI chip sales to China. I think you may already know that. Chips and Science Act of 2002 stipulates a $52 billion investment to boost domestic semiconductor production. So they are subsidizing semiconductor production in their own countries and preventing other countries from access to these technologies. And of course, they want to attract global AI talent. They are actively searching for researchers and engineers who are good at AI. They will give them a visa, H1B or O1 or EB2, NIW, whatever, who cares, to prioritize those individuals who are highly skilled AI professionals. They're talent hunting all over the globe. They're poaching global talent. US tech firms recruit top researchers from institutions here in China, I think you already know that, but also in India, for example, the IIT institutes. They are also blacklisting Chinese AI firms, placing trade restrictions on certain companies here in China, SenseTime, iFlyTech, Hawaii as Hikvision, etc., and so on, blocking chip and software access. They want to make sure, the US wants to make sure that ASML's extreme ultraviolet Graphy, don't even ask me what the hell that is. Machines and chip sales to China are prevented. They pressure their allies, China, Netherlands, South Korea, Taiwan, to limit China's semiconductor access. They want to ban TikTok here, there, and everywhere, or place it under security or scrutiny. And they sometimes see even something like TikTok as being a major problem for their national security, because it would manage to gather data which they don't want to give. And at the same time, they are pushing government-funded research. DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is really the institution that created the internet back in the 60s and 70s. It is funding military and defense AI projects. NSF, that's the National Science Foundation, supports academic AI innovation. National Institute of Standards and Technologies is basically sets all AI technical standards and so on. So they are subsidizing through the government research on semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and all of these things for a military purpose. And you can see today that the war in Ukraine and other wars that have taken place, the war that was occurring between Israel and Iran, and yes, even the war between India and Pakistan. And I know many of you are like, when are you going to stop the lecture so that we can ask you about the war between India and Pakistan? We'll also have some time to talk about that. But the shape of global war has changed. The shape of war has changed, with drones being used, missiles being used, and artificial intelligence being used to direct all of this. The control over technology is the key to controlling the world. So they won't let you have the technology to develop the third world, but they're ready to give it to their allies. They won't give it to Africa, but they're happy to give it to Australia. They have an agreement with Australia that they will share AI-driven defense intelligence. They have the Five Eyes Intelligence Network. They're happy to share technology between the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they have a NATO AI strategy to ensure that NATO has complete dominance as far as AI is concerned. And speaking of NATO, you know that they have recently taken the decision to increase military funding to 5% of each country's GDP. And they have explicitly said that this is in relation to Russia, China, and associated countries, Iran or whatever, and terrorism, etc. So this is a major, major, major escalation towards global war, towards a third world war. Very serious escalation. And they're going to spend trillions now, between now and 2035. They'll be spending trillions on AI, on semiconductors, on drone warfare, and so on, to achieve overwhelming superiority against Russia and China. And I would say that they want to go back to the period where they could park their gunboats on the shores of China and bomb the city, or bomb the shores of China. They want to go back to that period where they have that kind of overwhelming military dominance. All of this is driven by the fundamental relationship of an unequal exchange, a value transfer from the third world to the first world. For those of you who may have studied Das Kapital or may have studied Marx, you know that the prices of commodities are more or less conform to their value. However, wherever you have things that are produced unproductively, the price of the commodity in that particular instance, or things that are produced more productively, the price and the value of the commodity move away from each other. So the market economy is set up in such a way as to essentially reward those producers that are efficient and to punish those producers that are inefficient. So if you are producing above the average, if your productivity of labor is lower than the average productivity of labor found in society, then your price will be below the labor put into that commodity. And on the other hand, if you are producing more productively within a given economy, then the price, market price of that commodity will be above the actual value you put into that commodity. So in this way, sectors that are non-productive are actually transferring value to sectors that are more productive inside the capitalist system. Now take that idea and apply it globally. That's what's happening globally. Globally, the third world is transferring labor to the first world because the productivity of labor is higher in the first world and lower in the third world. So there's one process that's going on in which this massive transfer is occurring. But simultaneously, there's another process going on, which is that the terms of trade are also being manipulated in such a way as to benefit the West, to ensure that third world countries remain low-wage economies, resource-based economies. And this is done through various mechanisms. One of the mechanisms, of course, is the International Monetary Fund, that basically more or less takes over third world economies. This creates, in the context of many third world countries, a persistent trade deficit. We're importing more than we're exporting. The result is that we soon run out of dollars. And then we can't import anything. A country like Pakistan imports a quarter of its oil. When we run out of dollars, we can't import gas and oil. When we can't import gas and oil, you can imagine what happens to the economy. Suddenly you have massive inflation. You have a huge slowdown. You have stagflation. So then we desperately go to the IMF and say, please give us $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion. We get that money and then we can continue importing the things that we're importing. And then the economy stabilizes for a year or 2 years, and then the cycle repeats itself. So we have now done nearly 24 IMF programs since we became independent in 1947. These debts are then used further to ensnare third world economies, because then we lose control over our economic sovereignty. Because we've taken that money from the IMF, and because there are conditions attached to that, and because we need more money, the IMF says to us, to Pakistan, okay, we'll give you money, but to ensure that you can pay back the money, you have to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z with your economy. And so when the budget is presented in the National Assembly, you have to see a budget session in the Assembly of Pakistan. We already know the budget has been agreed with the International Monetary Fund. The Assembly just has to rubber stamp it. And most of the most important things have already been set. For example, what are taxation targets? Where are we going to get those taxes from? They're going to mainly be indirect taxes, so the burden is placed disproportionately on the poor and on the working class. Where we are going to spend, whether it's going to be in health and education, no, that's not going to be the case. Whether it's going to be in social services, no, absolutely not. Yes, we will spend on the military, that's good. We'll spend to pay back the debt, and that's about 80-85% of the budget right there. And of course, we have to pay government salaries, so that's another big part of the budget. So there's very little money left over. There's very little space, or what we call financial space, left over to really think about or determine, okay, to develop Pakistan, we're going to do ABC, we're going to go in this direction. There's no money for it. What this creates is a situation where in the core countries, in the central countries, accumulation is cumulative. It grows, it develops, capital grows. Therefore, wages increase. And in third world countries, it pushes out unemployment. The unequal terms of conditions, the unequal terms of trade. Unemployment goes into the third world, accumulation develops in the first world. So when the reserve army of the unemployed is pushed into the periphery, third world governments then become socially repressive. They have to be, because unemployment rates are high, inflation rates are high, there are no social services being provided. Whenever people go for the provision of social services, they say, sorry, there's no money, we can't do it, and so on. So that creates more repressive governments. And this also creates an obstacle to international proletarian unity, or the unity of the working class, because the labor movement in first world countries is looking at a very different scenario where the accumulation of capital is very high. But in third world countries where wages are very low, exploitation is very high, you have an entirely different situation. You also have a scenario where you have massive drain of surplus as well as capital flight, and now also debt. MNCs are taking their profits out of the countries in which they're operating, whether that's Pakistan. We have a scandal in Pakistan called the independent power producers, in which the government has to pay the power producers a certain amount of money even if we don't buy electricity from them. It's a huge scandal. Capital moves out of third world countries. For example, people who make money in Pakistan, they take their money and they buy real estate in Dubai. There are billions of dollars of property bought in Dubai by Pakistanis. There's debt dependencies where IMF programs force countries to prioritize debt repayment, and a perpetual cycle now of financial dependence. If you look at the overall trend, this has been going on not for the last 10 years or 20 years. It's been going on for a while, and I'm not going to quote you a communist source or anything. This is Oxfam, people, Oxfam. Oxfam says that the British Empire robbed India of $64 trillion. Or to put it the American way, $64 trillion. Sorry, my bad. They've taken out of India. Imagine that. This is during the colonial period. And 33.8 trillion of that benefited only the top 10%. It didn't benefit the people, it benefited the super rich. So this kind of free trade allows multinational companies to move to places where labor is cheap. In fact, they can cheapen labor. It creates a situation in which third world governments respond more to the imperatives of multinational companies rather than to their own people. Whereas capital can move rapidly from one part of the globe to the other part of the globe, labor cannot move in the same way. Although it does move, but it's tightly regulated. The periphery is connected to global labor markets in this way, and in the periphery, accumulation is stagnant, wages remain low. Look at average debt reservicing. In 2024, a report highlighted that on average, developing countries allocated approximately 41.5% of their budget revenues to debt servicing. Pakistan allocates nearly 50 to 55%. So half the money of the government is going where? Just to pay back debts. Any of you in debt? Are you in debt? Anyone here? Okay. Hopefully not. The majority of you are not, thankfully. But if you had to make a budget, if you were earning, you went and got a job in an architectural firm, and you had to pay half your salary every month to pay back your debt, you can imagine that you would be living hand to mouth. Except this is not happening with people. No, it is also happening with people. This is happening with entire countries. It's happening with the third world. Here is a heat map of debt repayment that you can see. In the third world countries, therefore, the government and the elite is what we refer to as a comprador bourgeoisie. A capitalist class that does not respond to the needs of the domestic market, but rather is connected actually to international capital, to the imperialist centers, to imperialist powers. And this creates a cycle of rent-seeking, corruption, and aligning interests of the country with foreign capital. What is good for foreign capital is good for Pakistan, not the other way around. And they support privatization, trade liberalization, deregulation, and of course this reinforces dependency. I was thinking when I was coming to China that I'd ask you this question. Why did, it's a very obvious answer and I've already given you the answer, but why did the British wage war during the Opium Wars? Why did they, what was the end goal that they wanted? Why did they feel they had to wage war?
They want to open the market.
Exactly. So they wanted to open the market, the emperor had closed the market, and they wanted to sell their things. there have been many different kinds of conquerors in history. There are conquerors who conquered other parts of the globe and created an empire. And when they would conquer a part, they would expect when they would conquer another society, they would expect to get tribute. This was the old form. They would get taxes. They would get money. Every season or every year, they would say, okay, you are conquered territory, you pay me tribute. And the tribute was already set. There are other kinds of conquerors who just like to conquer because they like to conquer. They wanted to punish some other society. They wanted to destroy it. In history, we've also seen that. We've seen these kinds of conquerors as well. These kind of conquerors that we see are the ones that want to conquer because, as you rightly put it, they want to buy and sell. They want to take control over markets. They want to take control over labor. They want to take control over raw materials. They want to take control over agriculture, lands, mines. The purpose of this kind of conquest is to take control, physical control of the resources of third world countries. Here is Pakistan going to the IMF for a $3 billion bailout. And every time we do this, we say to the public, the government says to the public, whether it's the present political party or the previous one, every single time, every politician says, I promise you, this is absolutely, inevitably, and irrevocably the last time that we will go to the IMF. The number of times I tell you I have heard that expression, if I could only have $5, every time I heard that, I would be a billionaire. I'd be richer than Elon Musk. So, where are we today? Here, this is where we are. We are in a situation where we have the super exploitation of the third world. This is why the third world is poor. Not because we are pre-capitalist or pre-modern, but because we are super exploited. There's a monopoly on technology, financial flows, military power, ideological, media production, and so on, and we can't seem to break free from it. And the key role in this is played also, sadly I have to say, by people of my own profession, academia. Global academia tends to be dominated by the ideological hegemony of these kind of capitalist ideas. Eurocentrism tends to be central to Samir Amin's analysis, but generally we see that the economic models of the West are considered to be the only model that can be applied. They are considered as a universal path to development. And IMF, World Bank, and other institutions, universities, etc., they teach students from third world countries the values of that basically when these people come back from studying in Western institutions. I myself have studied in Western institutions. I went to college in the United States, and then I went to college in the United Kingdom, and then I went to college in the United Kingdom again. I did my bachelor's in the US, I did my master's in the UK, I did my PhD in the UK. I was lucky because I had some very radical professors who taught me Samir Amin as well as other things. But generally, overall academia tends to go with what the IMF is saying. Any economist who stands up and says, you know what, I think we should nationalize power, or we should nationalize railways, or railways should be under state control. If I say that in a room full of economic students, they'll scratch their heads and say, hey, you're not an economist, you can't be an economist. Are you an economist? No, you can't. No, we can't. We don't accept. I mean, it's almost treated like some sort of, that you've been bitten by some sort of insanity or something. How can you say such a thing? It's like considered absurd. Similarly, with respect to parliamentary democracy, if you suggest that there could be forms of democracy that are different from Western parliamentary democracy, they look at you like you're crazy. So that's the hegemony of these capitalist ideas. Academia sadly promotes free markets, minimal government, privatization, liberalization, deregulation, lack of price controls, tight monetary and fiscal policies. All of these policies have resulted in disasters for much of the third world. Political science talks about democracy promotion. And well, we can all see what kind of democracy the West is moving towards of late, given what they've been doing with protesters who have been arguing against genocide in Palestine. Basically, third world countries that are considered to be successful democracies are those, or successful regimes are those that have good relations with the West, good economic ties with the West. And what are these successful democracies in the first world? They are essentially plutocracies. They're governments of the super rich. If you want an illustration of this, take a look at what's happening in the elections for mayor in New York City. So you see that Mahmoud Mamdani's son, Zohran Mamdani, Mahmoud Mamdani is also a very famous Marxist professor. His son Zohran Mamdani won the Democratic primaries in New York, and suddenly the entire establishment is saying, we are going to deport him, we're going to make sure New York gets no money, we're going to make sure that this election is blocked. Why? Because he's saying, I'm a socialist. And he's not going to nationalize anything. He's not going to expropriate the expropriators, as Karl Marx once said. All he's saying is, I'm going to raise the tax from 3% to 5%. Oh my God, no! We can't, what? 5% tax? Absolutely not. Deport him. If you look at the history of the third world, you see that in fact the West has actively promoted regressive and authoritarian regimes in the third world. Across Latin America, they supported military dictators. In Pakistan, we've had 4 long spells of military dictatorships. Every single military dictator was supported by the West. None of them was supported by a majority of the people of Pakistan. None of them could win in a fair and free election. It wasn't because Pakistanis love military dictatorships. It's because the Americans loved military dictatorships with respect to Pakistan. So they have supported very regressive ideas in the third world. For example, the birth and development of Islamic fundamentalism and extremism is intricately tied to how the United States, France, and Britain supported these ideologies and movements against national liberation struggles in the third world. They supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan through Pakistan, through General Zia. That's how Afghanistan went into today has a regime that does not even allow women to go to school. It's not because the Afghans wanted it, it's because it was created here in the 1980s through a huge CIA project. That project was called Operation Cyclone. In fact, it is the largest CIA project in the history of the CIA. All of this is now declassified. You can read, for example, Stephen Cole's work, Ghost Wars, to see it. So now to conclude, we see that development in the first world and underdevelopment in the third world are not distinct from each other. They're not separate from each other. They're not isolated from each other. They are two sides or two facets of capitalism. If I become a big capitalist and you all become my employees, and I grow richer and richer and richer on the basis of all the hard work that you do, and then I turn around and say to you, oh, you're only poor because of your culture, or you're only poor because of your own work habits. If you just have the work habits that I have, you would make so much money. It will sound almost absurd to you, because you might say, well, you know, I work so hard. I'm working day and night, and we are the people who are producing all these commodities, all these goods that are running this factory. You would think that this is an absurd idea because we are in a relationship of employee and employer. But when we think of the first world and the third world, suddenly we obscure that relationship because they're not in the relationship of employee and employer, but they are in a relationship of international trade and financial flows. And because of that relationship, we see this inequality. So the inequality is not created because the third world is not connected to international capital. Quite the reverse. It is created because of the history of capitalism in the periphery. Whether we talk about poverty, unemployment, instability or authoritarianism, all of these things are being exported into the third world because we are part of the proletarian districts, the working class districts of the global capitalist order. Amin has a solution. He says we've got to delink from the imperialist center. We need an autocentric development. The third world countries must reduce their dependence on Western dominated global markets. We should prioritize domestic economic needs. We should focus on self-sufficiency. We need to go towards a state-led method of industrialization. We need to promote national industrialization. We need to protect industries, limit foreign corporate control, ensure public ownership of strategic sectors, energy, banking, transportation, communication. These are key sectors. And China is already doing it. Here is a study that shows you how the state sector and the private sector are transforming with respect to each other. We should grow South-South cooperation. We need to have more interaction between countries of the third world. We need more regional integration. India and Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, we need to trade with each other. Pakistan and China, we need to develop trade relations with each other. And we need new financial institutions. We have to stop being reliant on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and so on. We have to have global institutions that are able to cooperate between the global south. And that's where, of course, BRICS comes in. On the one side, in the blue corner, you have the G7 countries. The G7 countries, of course, are the countries that are the original colonial powers. This is Britain, this is France, this is Germany, this is the United States of America, this is Canada and Japan on the other side. And then you have the alternative bloc led essentially by Russia and China. BRICS, of course, means Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So this is a new bloc which can now create alternative forms of development. And Trump is worried. I like it when Trump is worried. I love it when he's concerned. When Zoran Mamdani had Trump worried, I was smiling. So Trump is worried by BRICS. It's not just Trump who's worried. Western countries and their leaders, the global plutocracy, they're all worried. Listen to what Trump said. He said, I'm going to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS countries. I mean, that's nuts. That's crazy. Why is he so concerned about BRICS? Because he knows if this alternative bloc forms, the hegemony of the G7 will be broken. Last but not least, Amir says we need socialist-oriented development. Profit-driven capitalism will always lead to the creation of a periphery. It cannot but create peripheries. Whether capitalism is created in Japan, China, Russia, United States of America, it doesn't have to do with the fact that Europeans are genetically bad or something. It doesn't have to do with race. It's not driven by their history in the sense that they're just bad people or something. No, it's in the structure of capitalism itself. It's in the way in which that system is built. So if Pakistanis create capitalism and we win the race for capitalism, Pakistan itself will create a periphery. It will become the core country. It will create a colonial periphery. It has nothing to do with race or culture or history. It has to do, of course, with the way in which these systems are structured. So the only way to ensure economic justice is through a planned economy that prioritizes people over profits. People before profits. Profits are not what is important. People are important. This is the fundamental lesson. But for capitalism, people are not important. In capitalism, the people of the American continent were obliterated. The people of Africa were enslaved on a mass scale. Imagine not just what it did to the people who were enslaved, but to the entire African continent, from where the most productive people were snatched away in millions. So this kind of system is a brutal, barbaric system. And although there has been a phase of world global history in which we have passed through this system, but we must now pass through this system and evolve to a system which prioritizes people before profits. And that, of course, is socialism. That is a society in which you will have a distribution of wealth, in which the people who actually do the work are able to earn the living that they deserve from the work that they do. You have education, you have healthcare, and you have finally the economic liberation of the people of the third world. The future of humanity hinges on this essential question: whether we are able to pass through the stage of immaturity of humanity, the stage that we call capitalism, or that a stage of history in which human beings exploit other human beings, enslave them, use them. How quickly we are able to pass from this phase of history into a new phase of history where humanity is respected for being human, where they are no longer economically exploited, where people are able to lead lives in which they are prosperous and they are able to achieve for themselves the best that they are of themselves. And that can only be in socialism. That is the lesson we learn from Samir Amin. Thank you.